It is 11:33 p.m. at JFK Airport. Outside, it is a freezing 2 degrees Celsius. Shaq's giant hands shake from the cold. He just wants a bowl of hot soup on a sky-high first-class flight. He is here, after signing a $100,000 check for charity. But head flight attendant Reed refuses to serve him. Reed mocks him, saying the soup costs more than Shaq's clothes. What will happen? Because Reed is blind to an NBA legend. How will Shaq handle a locked booking system and a rude captain? Why did Sky High lose more money the next day than ever before? The terminal lights buzzed above Gate 14. Most travelers had gone home hours ago. A few cleaning carts rolled slowly across the tile floor. Shaq stood near the boarding door in a plain gray jacket. The jacket was old. One sleeve had a small tear near the elbow. He was not trying to hide who he was. He simply never talked about it. His 7'1" frame made him bend low to walk through the jet bridge. He did this every single time he flew. He never wanted to bump his head on a doorway in front of strangers. His flight number was SH-2291. He had just come from a charity dinner in Manhattan. The dinner raised money for kids without parents. Shaq had written a check for $100,000 that night. He folded the receipt and put it in his coat pocket. Nobody at the dinner knew his real net worth. He liked it that way. At the dinner, a woman named Carol had thanked him for coming. She ran a small shelter in Queens, feeding about 60 kids a week. Shaq had shaken her hand and told her to call his office if she ever needed more help. He never mentioned numbers. He never mentioned his name in headlines. He just wrote the check, ate a small plate of chicken, and left before the photos started. Now, standing at the gate, he felt the full weight of the long night pressing on his shoulders. His feet ached inside shoes that had to be custom-made. They were size 23, built by a small shop in Ohio that knew his measurements by heart. He had flown more than 2,000 flights in his life. Every single one reminded him that the world was built for smaller bodies than his. A gate agent named Priya scanned his boarding pass and smiled kindly. "Have a safe flight, sir," she said, not knowing who he was, simply doing her job well. Shaq smiled back and thanked her by name, reading it off her badge. Small kindness, given freely, always meant something to him. Now he just wanted warmth. His hands felt stiff from the cold outside. He rubbed them together as he stepped onto the plane. A gate agent had already checked his ticket twice. His seat was 2A, first class, window side. He lowered his body into the seat. The armrests pressed against his hips. He shifted his knees sideways to fit them under the tray table. This was normal for him. Most seats on Earth were built for smaller men. A flight attendant named Reed walked down the aisle with a clipboard. Reed had sharp eyes and a tight smile. He looked at Shaq for 2 full seconds before speaking. "Sir, we don't usually get passengers your size in row 2, Reed said. His voice was flat and cold. Shaq did not answer. He simply nodded once and looked out the window. Reed moved on to check other passengers. But he came back a few minutes later holding a small menu card. First class on this route included a hot soup service. Tonight's soup was a rich tomato-basil blend, made fresh in the galley. "I'd like the soup, please," Shaq said quietly. "It's cold out there tonight." Reed looked down at his tablet. He tapped the screen twice, then frowned. "System says your booking is locked," Reed said. "No meal service until it clears." Shaq blinked. "Locked how?" "I don't know. Happens sometimes with unusual bookings," Reed said. He said the word unusual with a small smirk. A few rows back, another passenger chuckled under his breath. Shaq felt his shoulders tighten, but he kept his face calm. "Can you check again?" Shaq asked. Reed tapped his tablet one more time. He shook his head slowly, almost enjoying it. "Still locked," Reed said. "Honestly, sir, that soup costs $22 a bowl. That's probably more than your jacket is worth." A woman in seat 2C gasped softly. Shaq said nothing. He turned his head back toward the window. The lights of the runway blurred through the frost on the glass. An older gentleman across the aisle, a retired teacher named Frank, leaned over and offered his own blanket without a word. Shaq shook his head gently and thanked him, though he did not take it. He did not want anyone else to feel obligated to fix what Reed had broken. Reed returned once more before the doors closed for departure, this time holding a small clipboard with passenger notes. He scribbled something quickly glancing sideways at Shaq the entire time. Whatever he wrote, he clearly wanted Shaq to notice him writing it. Just documenting the seat situation, Reed said, with a thin smile. Some passengers need extra notes in the file. Shaq did not ask what that meant. He simply watched the runway lights blink outside the window, one after another, steady and patient. Inside, something old stirred in his chest. It was not anger. It was something heavier, something he had carried since he was a boy in Newark, New Jersey. His mother, Lucille, used to work double shifts at a hospital laundry. She came home smelling like bleach and exhaustion. Sometimes there was no dinner until 9 at night. Shaq remembered standing in line at a corner store once. A clerk had told his mother she couldn't afford the milk in her hand. Lucille had put the milk back without a word. She held Shaq's hand and walked out with her head high. That memory never left him. He learned early that dignity mattered more than money. He learned that a quiet man could survive almost anything if he chose his moments. Newark had taught him other lessons too. His family lived in a small apartment near a busy street where the sound of buses never really stopped. Money was tight most months. Lucille sometimes skipped her own dinner, so Shaq and his siblings could eat more. She never complained about it out loud. She simply worked another shift, then came home and made sure homework got done. Shaq remembered one winter when the heater broke in their building. The landlord took 11 days to fix it, even though it was below freezing outside. Lucille wrapped blankets around her children and told them stories to keep their minds off the cold. She always said that a family with love in the room was never truly poor. He carried that idea with him for the rest of his life, even after the money came, even after the championships and the endorsement deals. He knew what it felt like to be cold, tired, and treated like less than a person. Tonight, sitting in seat 2A with a torn sleeve and stiff fingers, that old feeling came rushing back with surprising force. So tonight, on Flight SH 2291, Shaq chose silence. He folded his hands in his lap and closed his eyes. But Reed was not finished. He walked past again minutes later, deliberately brushing his card against Shaq's shoulder. Shaq's old jacket sleeve caught on the edge of a seat buckle and tore a little more. "Sorry," Reed said, though he clearly wasn't. "This aisle isn't built for oversized passengers." Shaq reached down and gently freed his sleeve. He said nothing. His silence was not weakness. It was a choice, one he had made 1,000 times before. A young flight attendant named Maya watched from the galley. She was 24 years old, new to the job, still learning the routes. She saw Reed smirk and felt her stomach twist. Maya walked over with a small paper cup of warm water and a folded napkin. She had no meal to give, since the system truly was locked for that seat. But she could offer something small. "I'm sorry about all this," Maya whispered, setting the cup down gently. "You deserve better than how they're treating you tonight." Shaq looked up at her. Her eyes were kind, tired from a long shift, but honest. "Thank you," he said softly. "That means more than you know." Maya glanced nervously toward the galley, where Reed was watching her with narrowed eyes. She hurried back to her station before he could say anything. Shaq wrapped his big hands around the small paper cup. The warmth barely reached his fingers, but it was something. He thought about closing his eyes and letting the whole night pass in silence. He was tired. He did not want to use his name like a weapon against a rude worker. He told himself, "I am just a tired man tonight." Nothing more. But another memory pushed through his mind. He remembered his father, a strict man, who worked long hours at a factory. Once, a store manager had accused his father of stealing, simply because of how he looked standing near the register. His father said nothing that day either. He simply paid for his items and left. Shaq had been 8 years old, watching from behind a shopping cart. He had felt the shame burn in his own chest, even though he had done nothing wrong. If he stayed silent forever, he thought, people like Reed would never learn. People like Maya would keep absorbing the damage meant for someone else. Still, he was not ready to act. Not yet. The plane taxied slowly toward the runway. An older man in a blue uniform walked down the aisle, checking overhead bins one last time before takeoff. His name tag read Silas. He was the senior cabin cleaner, staying on for a final safety sweep before the crew sealed the doors. Silas had worked at JFK for almost 30 years. He had seen thousands of passengers pass through this same jet bridge, famous and forgotten, kind and cruel. He moved slowly now, his knees stiff from decades of long shifts, but his eyes stayed sharp. He paused beside seat 2A. He looked at Shaq for a long moment, longer than most strangers did. There was recognition in his eyes, quiet and respectful. He didn't say a famous name out loud. He simply leaned down and spoke low, almost like a secret between two men who understood hard work. Real power isn't in your fists, Silas said. It's in who you choose to stand under your arm. He pressed a small folded napkin into Shaq's palm, then walked away before anyone could notice. Shaq unfolded it. In shaky handwriting, it said the same words again, as if Silas wanted him to remember them twice. Before moving to the next row, Silas turned back one more time. I raised 3 kids on this job, he said quietly. Every one of them turned out fine, because I taught them to notice who gets forgotten in a room. Then he shuffled forward, pushing his cart toward the next row, without waiting for a reply. Shaq stared at the napkin for a long moment. Something in his chest settled, like a key turning in an old lock. He thought of Maya, brave enough to bring him warm water when no one else would. He thought of the mocking tone in Reed's voice. He thought of his mother holding milk back on a counter, saying nothing, walking away with quiet strength. Tonight, though, quiet strength did not have to mean staying silent forever. Sometimes it meant choosing the right moment to act, and acting without shouting at all. Shaq reached into his coat pocket. Inside was an old satellite phone, worn at the edges, one he still used out of habit from his playing days. He typed a short message to the head of his private investment fund, O'Neill Venture Group. The message read, "Sell everything." At market open, he was not talking about a small stock. He was talking about his personal shares in Sky-High Airlines, shares he had quietly held for years. He had first invested in the company back in 2016, believing in its early promise to connect small towns with major cities. Over time, he had watched the leadership grow more focused on luxury lounges than on basic decency. Tonight confirmed everything he had suspected for months. He pressed send and placed the phone back in his pocket. There was no turning back now. Whatever happened next, this decision was already moving through the financial markets, quiet and unstoppable, like a river finding its path downhill. The plane lifted off the ground at 12:04 a.m. The cabin lights dimmed for the overnight flight. Most passengers pulled up blankets and closed their eyes. Shaq stared straight ahead, feeling the engines hum beneath him. About 20 minutes into the flight, the cabin temperature dropped sharply. Vents near first class hissed out cold air instead of warm. Shaq pulled his torn jacket tighter around his shoulders. Reed noticed the change and did nothing to fix it. In fact, he seemed pleased. "Seems like the AC's stuck on high," Reed said to another attendant, just loud enough for Shaq to hear. "Guess some passengers generate enough heat on their own." A man in row 3 laughed quietly. Shaq stayed still, jaw tight, hands folded. Captain Bennett stepped out from the cockpit a few minutes later to check on the cabin. He was a stocky man, with silver hair and a clipped voice. Reed quickly reported a false story, claiming a passenger in first class was causing a disturbance. Bennett had flown for Sky-High for almost 20 years. He believed strongly in rules, schedules, and order above almost everything else. He rarely questioned reports from his senior crew, trusting them without much thought. Bennett walked over to seat 2A and looked down at Shaq with cold eyes. "Sir, I need you to stay calm and stay in your seat," Bennett said, though Shaq had not moved an inch. "We don't tolerate disruptions on this aircraft." Shaq simply nodded. "I haven't said a word, Captain." Bennett's jaw tightened, unsure how to respond to that quiet answer. He glanced at Reed, who quickly looked away toward the galley. "Just keep it that way," Bennett muttered, less certain now than when he'd walked over. He turned and walked back toward the cockpit, muttering something to Reed about keeping an eye on problem passengers. Reed nodded quickly, eager to agree with anything that kept him out of trouble. A moment later, Bennett noticed the temperature gauge near the galley reading unusually low for first class. He frowned but said nothing about it, assuming a minor mechanical issue rather than deliberate mischief. He returned to the cockpit without checking further. Maya found a moment alone, with Shaq while refilling water cups. She leaned close and spoke in a hushed voice. "Sky High is drowning in debt," she whispered. $45,000 short this quarter, and management just cut ground crew pay to throw a fancy gala next month. Shaq listened carefully. He had already sensed something was wrong with this airline, beyond just one rude employee. Reed's cruelty was not just personal. It was part of a culture built, from the top down, a culture that valued image over people. "How long have you worked here?" Shaq asked quietly. 8 months, Maya said. "I took this job to help pay for my little brother's school. He wants to study engineering someday." She glanced toward the galley, checking that Reed wasn't watching. "Most of us try to do right by passengers. It's just hard when the people at the top don't care." Shaq nodded slowly. "Doing right by people is never wasted," he said. "Even when nobody with power is watching." Maya smiled, a small, tired smile, and pushed her cart forward before Reed could notice the conversation had lasted too long. He thanked Maya quietly and let her return to her duties before Reed noticed the conversation. Around 2:15 a.m., the plane hit sudden turbulence at 35,000 feet. The seatbelt sign flashed on with a sharp chime. Cups rattled. A baby somewhere in economy started crying loudly. Then the crying changed. It became a high, wheezing sound. A woman's voice rang out, from coach, panicked and desperate. "My son can't breathe. Someone help him, please." The boy's name was Tommy. He was 7 years old, traveling home from visiting his grandmother in New York. His mother, Denise, had packed his rescue inhaler in her checked bag by mistake, not realizing she would need it during the flight. Flight attendants rushed toward the sound. Reed, standing near first class, refused to move the emergency oxygen kit stored under his own seat. "That's reserved for premium cabin emergencies," Reed said flatly to another crew member. "Coach has their own kit, somewhere." But Coach's kit, it turned out, was broken, damaged from a prior flight, and never replaced. Precious seconds ticked by, while the boy's lips began turning pale. Denise screamed again, cradling Tommy against her chest, as his small body shook with effort. Passengers around her stood up, unsure how to help, murmuring anxiously in the dim cabin light. Shaq stood up. His full height filled the narrow aisle like a wall. 7 feet and 1 inch of quiet strength, finally moving with purpose. Passengers gasped as he stepped past startled flight attendants, without raising his voice at all. "Move," Shaq said. His tone was low, steady, and impossible to ignore. Reed staggered backward, suddenly unsure of himself. The commanding calm in Shaq's voice carried more weight than any shout ever could. Shaq grabbed the oxygen kit from beneath the first-class seat. He knelt beside the young boy in row 24, moving with surprising gentleness for such a large man. He had studied sports medicine for years, earning real degrees, not just trophies. He checked the boy's airway, adjusted the oxygen mask carefully, and spoke in a calm, steady voice to keep the child from panicking further. "Breathe slow with me, buddy," Shaq said softly. "In through your nose. Nice and easy." Shaq had studied kinesiology for years, and later earned a doctorate focused on human movement and health. Most people only remembered his championship rings. Few knew about the long nights he spent studying anatomy textbooks after practice. He checked Tommy's pulse against his small wrist, counting quietly under his breath. He watched the boy's chest rise and fall, adjusting the mask a few times, until the seal felt right. He kept talking the entire time, low and steady, like a heartbeat made of words. "You're doing great, Tommy," Shaq said. Just like that. Slow breaths. The boy's mother, a thin woman with tired eyes, gripped Shaq's massive forearm like it was the only solid thing in the world. Tears streamed down her face as her son's breathing began to steady. Passengers around them stayed silent, watching a giant of a man work with quiet skill and total focus. Someone in row 22 started recording on a phone, though Shaq never noticed and never seemed to care. Reed stood frozen near the galley, his earlier arrogance completely gone. Within a few minutes, the boy's breathing evened out. Color returned to his lips. His small hand reached up and grabbed Shaq's finger, unable to close around the whole thing. "Thank you," the mother whispered, sobbing quietly now, with relief instead of fear. Thank you. Denise sat beside her son for the rest of the flight, watching him sleep peacefully for the first time in hours. She kept glancing over at Shaq, wanting to say more, but unsure how to put such gratitude into simple words. "You didn't have to do that," she finally whispered. "Most people would have just called for help and waited." Shaq shook his head gently. "Waiting costs time you don't always have," he said. "I just did what needed doing." Denise nodded, tears welling up again. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small drawing Tommy had made earlier in the flight. It was a crayon sketch of an airplane flying over clouds. She placed it gently on Shaq's tray table. "He drew that before all this happened," she said softly. "I think he'd want you to have it now." Shaq looked at the simple drawing for a long moment. He folded it carefully and placed it in his coat pocket, right next to Silas's napkin. Two small pieces of paper, both carrying more weight than any dollar amount ever could. Maya watched from a few feet away, her phone buzzing softly in her apron pocket. She glanced down out of habit and saw a notification lit up on Shaq's phone screen, resting on the seat beside him. Divestment complete. Sky High Airline stock down 18%. Her eyes widened. She looked from the phone to the calm giant kneeling in the aisle, still holding a scared little boy's hand. Pieces started falling into place in her mind, though she said nothing out loud. Back near the cockpit, Captain Bennett received an urgent call from ground control. His face went pale as he listened. Sky High's stock had crashed overnight, wiping out $142.5 million in company value within hours. Word spread through corporate channels fast. Somehow, a large block of company shares had been sold at exactly the wrong moment for the airline's leadership. Rumors of a hostile buyout attempt began circulating among board members before the plane had even landed. Bennett's hands trembled slightly as he hung up the phone. 20 years of flying, and he had never seen a single overnight collapse like this one. He thought about the passenger in 2A, the one Reed had complained about, and a cold feeling settled in his stomach. He stormed back into the cabin, red-faced and rattled. He pulled Reed aside near the first-class curtain, speaking in tense whispers. "We need him to sign something," Bennett hissed. "A waiver, releasing us from liability for tonight, before this gets worse." "You think it's him?" Reed whispered back, his voice cracking slightly. "The stock thing?" Bennett didn't answer. He simply shoved the clipboard into Reed's hands and pushed him forward. Reed nodded nervously and grabbed a clipboard. He approached Shaq, who was now seated again, wrapping a thin blanket around the recovering boy's shoulders, as his mother thanked him one more time. "Sir, I need your signature on this form," Reed said, his voice shaking slightly now. "Just a formality, releasing the airline from responsibility." Shaq looked at the paper for a long moment, then looked up at Reed's nervous face. "I'll read it when we land," Shaq said calmly. "Not before." Reed opened his mouth to argue, but something in Shaq's steady gaze made him close it again. He backed away, without another word, nearly tripping over a seatbelt buckle in his hurry to retreat. The plane finally began its descent as dawn approached. The captain announced landing procedures in a voice noticeably less confident than before. Passengers gathered their things quietly, whispering about the night's events. Tommy slept peacefully against his mother's shoulder, his breathing slow, and even now, Denise kept glancing at Shaq with quiet gratitude, unsure how to express what she felt beyond simple words. At 6:05 a.m., the plane touched down at Los Angeles International Airport. As it taxied toward the gate, Reed glanced out the window and saw a cluster of black cars waiting near the terminal. Men in suits stood beside them, along with two airport security officers. Reed's confidence returned in a flash. He assumed the worst for Shaq, imagining arrest or public embarrassment for the giant passenger who had caused so much trouble. "Looks like someone's about to have a very bad morning," Reed muttered to Bennett, with a small, cruel smile. Bennett managed a weak nod, though doubt still gnawed at the edges of his mind. Something about the calm giant in seat 2A did not fit the picture Reed kept painting. The jet bridge connected. The cabin door opened. Cold morning air rushed in, carrying the smell of jet fuel and coffee from a nearby cart. A well-dressed man stepped onto the plane first, moving quickly past the flight attendants. He was the chairman of Sky High's board of directors, flown in overnight, after news of the stock collapse broke. His face was pale with worry and exhaustion. His tie was crooked, clearly tied in a rush before dawn. He walked straight past Reed and Bennett without a glance. He stopped in front of seat 2A and, to the shock of everyone watching, bowed his head low. "Mr. O'Neill," the chairman said, his voice trembling slightly. "We had no idea it was you last night. Please, accept our deepest apologies." The entire cabin went silent. Reed's smile vanished instantly. His face turned white as understanding crashed over him like cold water. He looked down at the clipboard still in his hands, the useless waiver suddenly feeling heavier than lead. Shaq rose slowly from his seat, filling the cabin with his full height once again. He looked at the chairman with calm, steady eyes, showing no anger, no gloating, only quiet certainty. "Your airline has a real problem," Shaq said evenly. "Not with me. With how you treat people who can't fight back." He turned to Maya, who stood frozen near the galley, still holding her drink cart. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a simple gold-edged business card. "You're the new head of customer experience, starting today," Shaq said, placing the card gently in her hand. "Build something better than this." Maya stared down at the card, tears welling in her eyes. She looked up at Shaq, unable to find the right words, and simply nodded through her tears. Reed stood frozen in the aisle, his clipboard now hanging limp at his side. Bennett's face had drained of all color, his earlier authority completely stripped away in front of the entire crew. Two security officers stepped forward and quietly escorted both men off the aircraft. Neither Reed nor Bennett said a single word as they were led away. There was nothing left to say. Shaq walked off the plane last, ducking low through the jet bridge doorway just as he had done at JFK hours earlier. His torn jacket sleeve fluttered slightly in the morning breeze, a small reminder of how the night had started. Outside, reporters had already gathered, alerted by the stock market chaos overnight. Cameras flashed as Shaq walked calmly through the terminal, saying nothing to the press, offering no interviews, no statements. One young reporter pushed forward with a microphone, asking rapid questions about the stock crash and his connection to it. Shaq simply raised a hand, palm open, a quiet gesture asking for space. The reporter backed off immediately, sensing there was nothing to gain by pushing further. By that afternoon, financial news channels were buzzing with the story. Sky-High Airlines had lost more value in 24 hours than in its entire previous decade combined. Analysts scrambled to explain the sudden collapse, unaware of the quiet man who had triggered it with a single 5-word message. One analyst on a morning show speculated about hidden investors and secret buyers, throwing out theories that had nothing to do with the truth. Nobody guessed that a tired man denied a bowl of soup had set the entire chain of events in motion. Behind the scenes, Shaq's investment team completed a secondary move few outsiders understood. Through a small holding company called Newark Bridge Partners, they acquired 51% of Sky-High's remaining shares. They bought control of the struggling airline at a steep discount before the market could recover. The deal closed quietly, without press conferences or champagne toasts. Shaq's lawyers handled the paperwork from a small office in Orlando, far from any cameras. He wanted the change to speak for itself, not his name attached to headlines. Within a week, Sky-High Airlines was formally rebranded. The new name appeared on freshly painted planes across the fleet, Hopewing Airlines. Its new mission focused entirely on flying free for cancer patients, orphaned children, and struggling veterans across the country. The rebranding took 9 days, from start to finish. Workers repainted the tail fins a soft shade of blue, with a small white feather logo on each side. Ground crews received a raise, the first real increase in 3 years. Nobody threw a gala to celebrate it. Instead, the company held a simple lunch in the main hangar, with sandwiches and lemonade for every employee. Reed and Bennett both lost their jobs permanently. Their professional licenses were reviewed and ultimately revoked, following formal complaints filed through proper aviation channels. There were no threats, no personal revenge, only the natural consequences of documented misconduct. Maya settled into her new role, within days, working from a small office, that used to belong to Sky High's old chief executive. She hung a simple handwritten sign above her desk. Dignity comes first, every single time. She spent her first month meeting with every department, listening more than she spoke, learning what real fairness looked like from the ground up. She started a simple training program for new flight attendants, teaching them to notice passengers who seemed tired, cold, or overlooked. She often told new hires the same thing Shaq had told her that night. Doing right by people is never wasted, even when nobody with power is watching. Within 3 months, customer complaints at Hope Wing dropped by more than half. Employee turnover slowed too, as ground crews and flight attendants finally felt heard by leadership. Maya kept a small notebook on her desk, filled with handwritten notes from passengers thanking the crew for small acts of kindness. Denise sent a letter to the new company a few weeks later. She wrote that Tommy still talked about the tall man on the plane who helped him breathe. She said her son had started telling people he wanted to study medicine one day, just like the giant who saved him at 35,000 feet. Maya read the letter twice, then pinned it to the wall behind her desk, right next to her handwritten sign. It served as a daily reminder of why the company existed now and what it had almost become instead. One quiet morning, weeks later, Shaq sat in that same office, now repainted with warm colors and soft lighting. A steaming bowl of soup rested on the desk in front of him. Tomato basil, the same kind Reed had once refused to serve. He lifted the spoon slowly, savoring the warmth, after so many years of understanding what it felt like to be dismissed. This simple bowl of soup, in some strange way, had cost the old Airline $142, $5 million in market value. He thought back to the napkin Silas had given him, still folded carefully in his wallet. He had read those words dozens of times since that night. Real power isn't in your fists. It's in who you choose to stand under your arm. He understood now, more clearly than ever, what the old man had meant. He had tracked down Silas a few weeks after the incident. He offered him a quiet retirement fund and a standing invitation to visit any time. Silas had simply laughed and said he preferred keeping busy, though he did accept a new set of work boots, sturdy ones built to last. Outside his office window, a Hope Wing plane taxied toward the runway, carrying a group of children from a local hospital toward their very first vacation. Shaq watched them go, a small, quiet smile crossing his face. He noticed his old torn jacket hanging on a hook near the door. He had kept it, refusing to throw it away despite Maya's gentle suggestion to replace it. Some things, he believed, were worth remembering exactly as they were, tear and all. On the desk beside the soup, he had also framed Tommy's small crayon drawing of an airplane. It was a quiet reminder of why that long night had mattered. Kindness, he thought, was never truly free. It always cost something, whether patience, humility, or courage. But arrogance, in the end, always cost far more. So here is the real question worth asking yourself tonight. When someone smaller than you seems easy to ignore, will you choose to be the giant who protects them? Or will you become the small, bitter voice that destroys everything around it, one cruel word at a time?